Hello and welcome to A Day in the Life. My name is Fred Hacker. I'm your host and community producer. And you're probably asking, why is he wearing that hat? Well, I've had some surgery and I'm saving you from having to look at the wound. This is program number 114 in the series A Day in the Life. I want to thank our sponsors, our perennial season sponsor, which is Bales, Dishaw, Holloway, RBC Dominion Securities. Special thanks to Kathy, to Michelle, and to Jeff for their continuing sponsorship of this program. And our show today is sponsored by Tom Smith Chevrolet Buick GMC. And a special shout out to Steve Jacklin for sponsoring our program today. Well, I'm delighted to be able to introduce to you our guest today. He is known as the promoter. From his early childhood in Peterborough as an entrepreneur to become one of the finest music producers in Canada. Stompin' Tom Connors calls him a promoter unlike anyone I've ever met. Welcome, Brian Edwards.
Well, thank you very much, Fred. What a pleasure it is to be here. And I'll tell you, I've been looking forward to this for a long, long time. And thank you very much for having me to be part of your day today.
Well, we've known one another for a long time, Brian, and I've been looking forward to this show too. So for the benefit of those who perhaps haven't seen our program before, we like to do kind of a biographical sketch of our guest, and then later in the program, dig into some of the interesting aspects of their career. So Brian, we're looking at the inspirations in your life, but we're also giving our audience a bit of inspiration by the success that you've had in your life. Can we begin at the beginning? Can you tell us where and when you were born?
I was born in a little town called Cordova Mines, Ontario, on August 18th, 1962, in my grandmother's kitchen, right beside the wood stove. So how's that for a detailed start?
It sounds like a Davy Crockett story.
Absolutely, you bet.
Now, I don't want to pry, Brian, but my understanding is that your mother wasn't married at the time you were born. And in that era, in the early 60s, that's probably a bit of a no-no in our society. What impact did that have on you?
Well, it certainly had a lot of impact on me, especially in latter years when I got it all figured out. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, back in those days, an unwed mother, that's probably why I was born in my grandmother's kitchen, because they wouldn't hear of that happening at a hospital or anything else. So it had a big impact on me. I certainly, now that I look back at it, I wouldn't have wanted it any other way. But at the time I was starting to find that out as an early teen, it was quite something.
I'm sure. Brian, one of the early influences, the very early influences in your life was country music. Tell us how that got started.
Well, I spent a lot of time with my grandmother, who was actually back in Cordova where I was born, and country music was a big thing. I mean, she had that, if it wasn't blaring on the radio at the time, she'd be singing country songs. So I was, as they say, I was weaned on good old country music, and I certainly was. I mean, it's certainly one of the first things I ever remember was that. And it dates back to shortly after I was born. And they say you don't remember any of that sort of stuff as you get going older, but I certainly know there was something there that got me the appetite.
And your grandfather also had a connection to country music.
He did. He was a square dance caller. And in those days, there was no amplification or microphones. The fiddle player would get up and he'd stand on a table and tell you exactly what he was going to do, and away he'd go. So he did a lot of that back in those days.
Now, Brian, and when you weren't very old, your mother made a decision that she was going to put you up for adoption. That didn't happen in the ordinary way because of an intervention by some other family. Can you tell us about that?
My mother had met another gentleman that she was going to marry, and again, that you didn't really bring a lot of baggage with you in those days. So she had a choice to make whether she put me up for adoption. My grandparents were getting a little too old to raise me. They would have liked me to have stayed there, but an aunt and uncle of mine in Peterborough actually came to the table and said that, listen, we would rather have him here and we'd adopt him instead of you putting him in any kind of an orphanage or up for adoption. So that all worked out very, very well, and it was a good thing for me.
Let's talk about your education, Brian. There were some teachers and personalities when you were in primary school that treated you kind of special. Can you tell us about that?
Well, they were very well aware what I was doing. There was a grade 8 teacher that I'd had who was also the principal of the school when they were at Gary Stanford. And he was very, very supportive and let me do a lot of things that were beyond um, the formal education side of things and let me do all kinds of things because he knew that I was in this entertainment world. And even at that age, I was really getting plugged into it. Even I think grade 6 or 7 when I first started to really dig in and show interest. And they were very supportive. Just let me go and do whatever I wanted to do.
You're fortunate to have that positive reaction. And then when you got to high school, there were some courses that you took that really played into your interest in the entertainment industry.
I did. I found one of the things that I was going to need to know was the business side of things. I loved accounting and I loved law and I loved English and I loved drama and all that sort of stuff. And it really helped as I got going on, especially the accounting stuff played a big part of it. And those teachers were exceptional with me. Absolutely. The high school principal, I mean, he had written me a letter saying, you're going to learn a lot more on the road doing what you're doing than you're going to learn in here. And I want you to go do it. But I still was able to keep an 80 to 85% average, even doing what I was doing. So they were quite happy.
Good for you. Well, Brian, we're going to get into more detail because some of our viewers are probably wondering what exactly it was that you were doing. So we will get into that. You were doing some commercials on radio and you were getting into the music promotion business at a young age. I'm interested, just before we leave the schooling, what would be the reaction of the other kids to the fact that they could hear you doing commercials on radio and see you with all the acts coming to town?
Well, it varied. Some thought I was absolutely out of my tree, and other ones thought it was quite good, actually. The ones that I was really close to knew exactly what I was doing, but it worked out well for me that they did because they were able to keep me grounded too, and I also could be a kid with them, and that was a big deal for me.
In your book, you make reference to the fact that your friends allowed you to be a kid, even though in many ways you were living in an adult world.
Well, I needed that. And especially as I got older, I could look back and say, I really was a kid. I could go fishing and swimming and riding bicycles and all that other stuff and still carry that stuff on. And yet I knew how to turn that off and turn this on real quick. So,
Brian, there was a character, and I think that's a fair word to use, in Peterborough in radio at the time, who played a huge part in your life. Tell us about that individual.
His name was Sunshine Sean Eyre, and Sean was a country radio DJ here in Peterborough. And in those days, those country DJs, I mean, they ruled the roost because they were very popular in the community. It was personality radio in those days. It wasn't just spin this and spin that. I mean, but he kept an open door there. And the open door was call me at any time and anything you wanted to hear. And I took full advantage of that. Trust me. I was on there every day, day in and day out. And one thing led to another. And, we became very, very, very close friends.
He was doing some promoting of concerts and he was invited to the Imperial Room to meet a big star of the day. You ended up taking advantage of that invitation. Tell us who that was and how it came about.
Well, I was in grade 8 at the time, and my sister Ella, I called her up and said, look, I got this opportunity to go to the Royal York. Carol Baker is going to be the first country music artist to play the Imperial Room. And there was a press conference up there. And here I was going up there with my little cassette tape recorder in grade 8, going up to this press conference at the Royal York. So it was quite a thing for me. And that's when the teachers come in very much to give their blessings and said, this opportunity you cannot turn down. You've got to go. So it was great.
Did you work at the radio station with Sunshine Sean?
I did. I was doing some commercials at that time, and he had started back in radio in Lindsay at that time, actually doing a country show. And that's where the invitation had came to there. And of course, he was doing the show during the day. So it was by default, I went, and there I was.
Now, he actually played a larger role than just a business mentor. Didn't you actually move in with him and his wife?
Yes, and I was about 17 years old. I had moved into their house with them for no reason. There wasn't any problem at home or anything. It just seemed to be more convenient that I could be there and really be close to the nest. And work a little bit more in the radio station that I did. And I was there all the time anyway. So it worked out quite well. So I was there at the time I was 17 years old, absolutely. And we formed quite a bond. There's no doubt about it.
Another name in the Peterborough area that was significant for you was a fellow named Doug Nobes. What was his role, and what impact did he have on you?
Well, Doug was the manager of the Peterborough Memorial Center, and Doug had been there for many, many, many years. And he was another Cordova boy that actually ended up there.
Really?
Yeah, yeah. So it worked out well that Doug took me under his wing and showed me everything that could be done in this industry, from selling box office tickets to booking an act to everything you could think of there. And he really, really, really helped me a lot. Introduced me to a lot of people I'd never met before. And still, I was very young at that point, but I was a part-time job down there, and it was great.
Brian, did you ever think about going to university?
Oh, you bet. I thought that would have been the greatest thing. I was never sure what I was going to do or what I was going to interrupt to, but this thing took over so quick that I didn't have a chance to do that. And I often regret that. I would have liked to have been to college or university, and I'm still in the back of my head someday that I may become what they call a mature student in one of these places.
Yeah, good for you. Now, Brian, before you got your license to do promoting, you actually were doing some promoting. And if my arithmetic is right, you were just 15 or 16. And there was an act came to town, a fellow named Eddie Eastman. What did that lead to?
Well, it worked out well because Sean and I had promoted a show with him over in Lindsay at the Academy Theatre. And his manager was named Bob Cousins, was the man's name. He was a school teacher from Stephenville, Newfoundland. And he said, you should come on the road with me sometime and I'll show you exactly what this business is all about. So for 2 weeks, I got in the car with him and I drove down to the East Coast. And that was long before a fax machine, internet, cell phones, or anything. And he took me under his wing for 2.5 weeks, and we went all over the East Coast. And every night Eddie was performing in different places. And I really got a chance to see what it was all about. And that really gave me the get up and go.
That sealed the deal in terms of how you were going to spend your life.
Oh, it did. You bet.
Now, you got a license as a music promoter at the age of 17.
Yep.
Why did you apply? Had anyone else ever done that at that age?
Well, from what I can figure out and what they tell me, no, because it was quite a thing to go through. Actually, Sean Eyre, who I was working with, he wanted to get the musician's union license, and he couldn't because in those days, the American Federation of Musicians would never allow a disc jockey to hold a license. They always felt it was a conflict of interest and never allowed that. So here I go. I go in at 17 years of age and fill this form out. I have to get 3 reference letters, 2 letters from the bank, and everything else. And so here I am, 17 years old, sitting in this little room with a round table at it, and the board of directors at this table. And they just grilled me like crazy. And 2 of the questions they asked me was, am I financially stable? And what does Sean Eyre have to do with this? And of course, the first question I answered was yes. And the second one, he said he's got nothing to do with it at all. Well, they all knew that he did, but they didn't. So they have this vote around the table, and there's like 7 people, and 3 vote for me and 3 vote against me. And the president of the Musicians Union, my name is Rip Sanders, he put his hand up and I got the license. And I still renew it every year, 41 years later.
Oh, good for you. Now, your first big show came shortly after that. And it was with a performer who has really been a key part of your career all the way along. Tell us about that first act.
Well, it was a big deal for me. They had a festival in town here called the Festival of Lights. And the gentleman, we were doing some local entertainment for him anyway. And he said, we really want something big here. We want to know if we can get Tommy Hunter here. So Sean had met him many, many times over the years and had him on the radio show. So I reached out and got a hold of Tommy's lawyer in London, Ontario, and we started to work back and forth. And sure enough, it wasn't long before we had the deal cut and he was coming to town here. And that was a big thing. I mean, for me at that young age, booking a superstar that was on television, that was a big thing. Yeah. So he came in here to town and did the show and everything. And we were shaking hands and kissing babies and all that good stuff. And it come time to pay him. And he kept saying, I think you better go get your father. It's time for me to be paid. And I said, why would I get my father? And he says, well, you're not old enough to book me. And I said, well, I'm afraid I am. And I pulled out the check and gave it to him. And he looked at me and said, I would never have ever dreamt this would ever happen. And so sure enough, that was the big show.
That's great. That's great. Now, the next, as I understand it from the book, the next big act to come into your life was Miss Kitty Wells. How did that come about?
Well, Sean had booked a show with her over in Lindsay at the fairgrounds. And we went to do that show. And I was pretty emotional that night because my mom used to rock me to sleep to an old Kitty Wells song called How Far Is Heaven. And I really, really got emotional when we did that date because it really meant a lot to me. I mean, Kitty Wells in our house she was the queen of country music. She was the queen of our house.
Yeah.
And we really bonded well. I mean, her and her whole family were just so gracious to me that it turned into, we booked them again the following year in Bobcaygeon, Ontario, and so on and so forth. So it was a big deal for me.
You mentioned the family. Her husband, Johnny, was a musician in his own right. Nice. And their son, Bobby, was also a musician. Did they all perform in the shows that you booked?
They did. Johnny Wright was a member of an old duo called Johnny and Jack, which was way back to one of the first original country music duos that they had going. And Bobby Wright, their son, had about 7 or 8 hit records, but he was also on the McHale's Navy television show.
Oh, okay.
With Ernest Borgnine and Tim Conway and all those guys. And he was on there for the whole get-go, right from the beginning, right through to it finished. But he was a great, I still talk to Bobby almost daily. He's a great guy. Really nice fellow.
Now, you mentioned booking the Kitty Wells show a year later in Bobcaygeon. And at that time, Johnny extended an invitation to you.
Oh, boy, did he ever. He said, why don't you come down to Daytona Beach, Florida with us next week? We're going on a family vacation. So I called my sister up, Ellen. I said, look, I'm invited to go down to Florida. She says, can I come with you? And I said, well, I'm calling to see if you would come with me. So down we go. And we're having a great time playing water volleyball and doing everything you can think of. And we go out for dinner one night and we're laughing and carrying on. He said, I want you to meet me for breakfast the next morning at 9 o'clock. And I said, okay. So I go meet him for breakfast. And he said, we've decided we want you to be our promoter and agent in Canada. I looked over.
Wow.
I said, that's funny. I said, here I am. I 18, 19, 20 years old, whatever I was. And I said, you got to be kidding. And he said, no, we want you to take over everything for us. And I'm thinking, my God. So, of course, that was an easy answer in those days. You bet. When can I start? So that was the beginning of the real rocket that we got on. That's what it was.
So he introduced you to Nashville, and he introduced you to one of the big performers in Nashville. Tell us about Wilf Carter.
Wilf Carter was a great Canadian legend that originally was born in Nova Scotia and ended up going out to Alberta. And I'd written Wilf a couple of letters, and I didn't hear any response back. Well, Johnny introduced me to him one night in Hamilton, Ontario. And he was 80 years old. And that following May, we took him on the road with Kitty and Johnny, and we toured him for 14 years. Wow. It was the most successful act by that time that I'd ever, he set this whole organization up. He was so popular and so insistent that as a promoter, I made money. It was absolutely scary. So Wilf was a big influence to me. We toured him until he was 94 years old. Wow. It was great. I love him to death. It was fabulous.
Just reflecting for a moment, it's interesting how many big influences there were in your life just in the first 2 decades. Brian, you were very fortunate to make these contacts.
Well, I'm glad I really did, because the more I look back at this, a 17-year-old in this industry would be eaten alive if I didn't have those people, because it's not what you'd call sometimes a very pleasant business. It can be very nasty, and you need good people behind you. And the Tommy Hunter story opened it up, and then came Kitty and Wilf and so on and so forth. But one leads to the other. If you make a mark with these people, it will move on. And obviously, so it was good.
Well, the next name I want to ask you about is a little bit out of the country realm, because the next big act that you became involved with wasn't a country singer. It was Frank Mills.
It was. Frank Mills had an agent manager by the name of Paul Massioli that lived in Vancouver. And Paul wrote me one day and said, listen, we're going to do some dates in Ontario with Frank Mills. Would you like to do some? And I said, are you out of your tree? I said, I would be no advantage to Frank Mills, and I'd be scared to death. He said, look, it's the same audience. They just like different music, same thing.
Yeah.
So I took a shot at it, and it was fabulous. And he was such a great guy, and I found out that I could promote that stuff. It wasn't just country I could do, and Frank opened the door for me to go a different route and still keep the country roots, but I was able to go get myself kind of introduced to another side of things, which I'm really glad I did.
And who would some of those artists be that you would have met through the connection with Frank Mills?
Well, another great piano player by the name of Haygood Hardy, and then of course came Roger Whittaker, and then Rita McNeil, the Von Trapp family, the Lawrence Welk Show. It opened Patty Page. It opened everything up for me. And he was absolutely right. That audience is not 1 ounce different. It's the same age of audience I was used to catering to, just a bit of a the taste in music were a little bit different. So it was great. Well, Frank's song was #1 on the country charts too, that Music Box.
Yes. Yeah.
So it wasn't that far astray for me, so I could certainly relate to it.
Now, you mentioned the Lawrence Welk Show, and you actually took the Lawrence Welk Show on the road. Although it was a mainstay on television, you introduced it to a live audience.
Well, we did. Variations of it had taken place over the years. There was 26 regular acts on that show. They're all plus the orchestra on top of it. And I seen a version of it in Toronto, and I said, I want to step this up a notch and see if I could take this thing across Canada. So we put 25-piece orchestra, put 6 of the entertainers, and away we went, because I had been exposed to that with my other grandmother in Warsaw, Ontario, who loved the Lawrence Welk Show on Saturday nights, and I stayed a lot with her. So I kind of knew who they were as a kid. And that was absolutely, I felt I'd really gone to the moon after that, because it just opened me up to a totally different realm completely. Big band and orchestra stuff. Now there you go. That's totally new for me. And it was great. One of the best experiences I ever had.
Ryan, you mentioned that a lot of these acts you were touring across Canada, but that sounds like you were getting into the American market as well there. Did you take any other artists into the States?
I did. Of course, we toured Tommy there quite a bit, and Rita McNeil and Frank Mills and John McDermott and the Leahy family. We did every state but 2 with them.
Wow.
Of course, a lot of dates with the Lawrence Welk Show and Red Green, and probably done about 1,000 dates down there in total over the years. So it's great. Really, really good. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the Leahy family.
Yes.
And then your association with them began in the mid 80s, as I recall.
It did.
But Brian, you would have only been 23 or 24 at that time. Tell me about the relationship with them.
Oh boy, that was great. They have a farm just outside of town here in Lakefield, Ontario. I'd go hang with them out there, and we just have a riot. I mean, I'm telling you, that was fun. I mean, we worked hard, but boy, did we play hard. We had a lot of fun. We did whitewater rafting together and God knows what. I mean, we just had a ball. And they were so good. I mean, we'd go to any place in the world with them and you couldn't follow them. You take 11 brothers and sisters doing it as well as they did it. We were I'd go to these big conventions and they'd say, now look, when you're on the show tonight, we've got to close the show. I'd say, fine, no problem. Let us go first. God help you. Because once they got up there, you didn't want to follow them at all.
That's neat.
They were great.
Well, we're going to change course a little bit here, because the next act in the sort of evolution of your business was Charlie Pride.
It was a festival in Gaspé, Quebec. A gentleman called me up there at the Wakeham York Homecoming Festival. How's that for a memory? And he said,
great.
We want to bring Charlie Pride in. So I called this gentleman by the name of John Danes down in Dallas, who was Charlie's booking agent at the time. Great big Englishman with a great sense of humor and everything. And they flew from Dallas to northern New Brunswick, drove from northern New Brunswick to Gaspé, and drove back. And I got so sick I couldn't even go to the show. I was so nervous, my back went out. I was on the floor. So my sister Ella had to go. But that was a monster. I mean, Charlie Pride has sold second best-selling act to Elvis Presley on RCA Records. I mean, that was a big deal. I mean, they sold like 48 million records around the world. So to me, that was like, wow, I really made it.
He's on the wall over your shoulder there, isn't he?
Yes, keeping an eye on me every day.
Yeah.
You
Now
bet.
he had a name for you that I think is funny.
The whippersnapper, the
The
young
young
whippersnapper.
whippersnapper.
Yeah, he would say that. I ran into him at a Cracker Barrel in Branson one day because he'd settled into Branson for about 7 years. He started theater there and no road work at all. And he said, I told my agent, when I come back up on that road, I want that young whippersnapper that I work with to do this. And that was in 1999. And we toured together for a long, long time. And then year after year after year. And I mean, he is a monster. I mean, it was, and you would never, he was just so gracious. And the people were so professional that were behind him that I worked with. They were just great.
Good. Now I'm gonna suggest that the next person we talk about was really kind of the big time for you. You met a guy named Tom Connors.
Oh boy.
Tell us how you met him.
When I was 8 years old, my father was a truck driver for what they call TPT transport here. Anybody who knows about hockey don't know the TPT Pete's came from Peterborough that developed a lot of big hockey players. But anyway, he drove for a transport company called TPT, and we'd have house parties at our house all the time. That was a regular doing on the weekends. My dad called square dances, and this gentleman he worked with was named Boyd McDonald, who was also a waiter at a local bar, and he knew Tom quite well. So, matter of fact, he gave Tom the name Stompin' Tom because he was only Tom Connors when he came here until Boyd said Stompin' Tom Connors and the name stuck to him. We'd have these parties and Tom would come to them at the house. So I got a chance to see him there. And then a few years later, he was at the exhibition in Peterborough and then so on and so forth. And I hadn't seen him for many years because he got out of the business. And we met up in Toronto and I've been trying desperately to get him to go on the road and he had no part of it. So one thing led to another. And before you know it, the phone call comes and up to Belnafad, Ontario I go till 5 o'clock in the morning and meet Tom again. And we worked out a deal. It took us about 8 hours to do it, but we never looked back. I mean, it was great.
Now I have to confess that I didn't really know a lot about Stompin' Tom, a lot about the behind the scenes thing. He was quite an entrepreneur.
Well, you bet. He had a record company called Boot Records, and they owned 3 music publishing companies at the time. And that music publishing company, they controlled 8 out of every 10 songs performed on radio in Canada.
Wow.
That's how big it was. Because they bought all the international rights up. That's how the vision was. And in those days, I mean, Tom hadn't worked the road for 15 years, so he was living on the royalties from that company. But that record company was huge. I mean, not only did it have the Stompin' Tom catalog, Leona Boyd and Rita McNeil. They had 175 acts on that record label. It was a monster. And he ran all of that. Nobody knew that, but behind the scenes, he was there running it.
So he really put you on the map in many ways.
Well, he did because the tour he wanted to do was 70 shows all across Canada. Well, as much as I'd been across the country, I hadn't been up to like Fort St. John and Dawson Creek and a few places like that where he wanted to go. We even went to the Magdalen Islands, believe it or not, and did a show.
Yeah.
Because he married a lady from the Magdalen Islands, Lena, and we went up there and did a show there. So when we went across the country with him, we went across the country. So I got to see everything. And from there, I had the knowledge to go anywhere I wanted to go in Canada because he opened that door and he wanted to go to the smaller communities, which was great, like Coldwater and Matheson, Ontario, and Huntsville and places. That's what he wanted to do. So it was good.
You brought a lot of acts into our central Ontario region over the years. Penetangwisheen Arena,
You bet.
you mentioned Coldwater and so forth. Wonder, Brian, time is never our friend on this program, but once you had done that tour with Stompin' Tom, you ended up representing a lot of other artists. And I'm just wondering if you can share with our viewers some of the names of some of those acts that came up in that era.
Well, there was just, I mean, it was 130 of them all together, from Tammy Wynette to George Jones to Mel Tillis to Roy Clark to Gene Watson to, of course, the Kitty Wells story, Little Jimmy Dickens, Hank Snow, Porter Wagoner, and up on this side of the border, of course, there was Ian Tyson and Al Cherney, Graham and Eleanor Townsend, the Leahy family, and they all had a very common thread for me that they were all good family shows that I was really used to working with. So
Yeah.
it all worked out very well for me because one led right into the other. I worried about that, whether that would connect or not, but once the dots got connected, it was great.
You also toured the Von Trapp family
Oh boy,
of children,
I sure did.
and John McDermott, who's a bit out of the wheelhouse that you've been in before.
Well, two things. Let's go to John McDermott first. John, a lot of the acts I worked with was with Capitol Records in the day, and John was working for the Toronto Sun in the back room where they packed the papers up to move them out there. And of course, he got involved with Conrad Black and a few other people, and they did this record. Well, Frank Mills put John on a few of the dates that we did because he hadn't really done a lot of touring before. So we took him out to Winnipeg and Thunder Bay and a few spots. Well, I became quite close to John, and we got a chance to do lots of touring together, and it was great. And the Von Trapp story, I love the Leahy so much that I happened to see an article one time that had tour routing. We used to get this magazine called Polestar, and it would list all the acts and where they were going. And I seen the Von Trapp children. I thought, what's that all about? Well, it turns out they were the great grandchildren of the original Von Trapps. And
Oh, really? Yeah.
normally they'd be living in Vermont. This particular family moved out to Kalispell, Montana. So I called an agent in Atlanta that looked after them, and I said, listen, they're coming to Stratford. I got to go see this. I have to go see these people. Well, I still have never seen the Sound of Music movie ever, not through the whole thing. So we went to see them in Stratford, and I melted. I watched these young performers get up there. And not only were they young and cute, but I'm telling you, they stopped the world because they're so good. Acapella, it scare you.
Yeah.
And I wanted to deal with I had to get a tour. So sure enough, out we went, coast to coast in Canada. And they'd fly in 2 weeks ahead of the dates to go meet the media and sing for them. That's all we needed them to do. Once that happened, we'd have the front page of every major paper across Canada. That's how good they were.
That's great.
Really good.
Now, I've been dying to get to the next name, and I'm not sure how many of our viewers will recognize this name, although if they've watched earlier editions of our show, they will. A fellow named Steve Smith. How did you meet him?
Steve Smith. He's my buddy. His brother, Steve, had left, had done many years of the Red Green Show as the star and the writer and so on and so forth. And he had finished up the show, and he and his brother started an organization in Toronto called S&S Productions, which stood for Smith and Smith. And they were doing a lot of post production for television shows. And Andrew Barnsley and I had been good buddies for many years. And Andrew had worked for S&S downtown Toronto, and we did a lot of DVDs there with them. Andrew and I owned a company together, and we did a Stomp and Tom DVD and Rita McNeil and so on and so forth. So I said to Steve's brother one time, Dave, I said, listen, we got to go on the road and do some dates with Red Green. He says, oh, he's giving away that hat. He'd have no part of this. He's wanting anything to do. He's taking up golfing. So I kind of thought, well, that's too bad. Well, 3 years later, Dave phones me and he says, listen, can you meet me at a restaurant in Hamilton? I said, what's up? He says, I'm bringing my brother to a meeting. Well, I get to this meeting, and I never met Steve before, and he pulls an ad out of his pocket that he had from a WestJet flight of a Stomp and Tom tour. He pulls this ad out and he says, look at all these towns. That's where I want to go. He says, if you take this guy there, this is Red Green country you're going to. That's where I want to go.
Yeah.
So it was a story that just, we did that first tour, and halfway through it, he says, my God, man, we've got to do a lot more of this. This is the best fun I've ever had. And I said, it's the best fun I've ever had too, because you're the easiest guy I've ever worked with. So we had a wonderful, still do have a wonderful relationship. I just adore him. He's a great guy.
Brian, you were at the Midland Cultural Centre the night that Steve Smith, Red Green, was on this program, A Day in the Life. And I still get teased about the fact that I started laughing 30 seconds into that. And I just couldn't stop laughing. As Steve Smith, he's hysterical as well as Red Green. And brilliant.
I never missed the show with him at all, ever.
Yeah.
And every night he'd tell the same story, and I'd laugh harder and harder and harder every night. His delivery, and he's like that all the time.
Yeah.
Like it never, like no matter where you are or what you're doing, that sense of humor is right there, everywhere. He's brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
we've done 114 of these shows, Brian, and I have to say that there's not a guest that I have loved more than Steve Smith. Like I'm jealous of you. I would love to have Steve Smith in my life. He is so funny.
Well, I've never worked with an artist more fair and more precise and more clued into the business world than anybody other than Stompin' Tom. I've often thought that was his twin because they thought alike, they did business the same, and he was just as when he shook your hand and said, "We're going to do this," that was all you needed.
He's also very humble, which is surprising with the huge success he's had.
Oh, the most humbling person I've ever met.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Now, when you did that tour across the states, that was the third biggest tour going on in the USA. Like, this is big time, Brian.
That tour in 2019, thank God it wasn't in 2020, but it was number 3 for 4 weeks in a row all across North America.
Wow.
Red Green capturing the hearts of America. We'd go into places like Phoenix, Arizona, and St. Paul, Minnesota, and we'd have 3,000 or 4,000 people at those shows. It was gigantic. And he'd shake hands and kiss babies with all those people after that show for hours and every night. It never quit.
Yeah, it's quite a talent. Well, let's change gears just for a second. One of the things that you did fairly recently was a tribute show, which is kind of a little different for Brian Edwards.
Oh, yeah. Darren Walter is a great friend of mine who does all our technical directing and helps out a lot with on a daily basis. Just we talk every day. He has a wonderful dinner theater on his property up in Bright, Ontario. And he had a show in there called Oh, What a Night. And he said, "You really got to watch this. This would be big on the road." And I said, "Darren, I'm scared. I would be spooked of a tribute show. I'm always afraid we're going to get sued or something." So he sent me a video one night and I seen this show and I started to watch it. And I started to watch that audience, how they reacted to this thing. I called him up the next day and I said, "Call them up and make an offer for 3 weeks on the road." And he said, "Well, that's funny." I said, "No, I mean it." And we took that show out for 3 weeks. And we've probably done 30 tours with them since. I just think they're fabulous because they know what they're doing. It's good. It's well produced, well written. Tracks are great, and they get out and do their job. I've seen tribute shows that shouldn't be out there. So when I seen this one, I knew there was nothing to be afraid of. It worked good.
Yeah, good for you. And then along came COVID.
Boy, did it ever.
What'd that do to your business, Brian?
There's an old country song called "Stop the World and Let Me Off."
Yeah.
That's pretty well it. That's the best way I can describe it. We were getting ready to go. I called Darren. We were supposed to start in Kingston, Ontario for a massive tour across Canada with a show called Yesterday Once More, which is produced by the same people as Oh, What a Night. And literally the week before, everything shut right down. I mean, it was just like, and the weird thing about it was, depending on what part of the country I talked to, a lot of the places like Surrey, British Columbia, we were going in there. And guy called me, he says, "Everything's fine here. We've only had one case in the school." I said, "One case in the school?" I said, "I'm not taking these entertainers in that school in the public." And all of a sudden, it would be horrible. So we had to shut that all down. We had a Charlie Pride tour ready to go out 3 weeks after that. We had to shut it down too. And other than doing a couple of podcasting type shows, and now called, see, that's how much I'm not plugged in. They're not called podcasting, live streaming shows.
Yes.
With Jim Cuddy for my friends at Irving Oil in the East Coast. And they were great. I mean, very professional. I felt very proud of them. I don't think that's what I want to do for a living. That's not my idea of live entertainment. And the whole point of it is you have to be in the same room with the entertainer at the time. And that's what makes it work.
Brian, I want to ask you a few questions about the industry.
Okay.
You are the insider's insider in terms of the music industry in this country. How do you're a promoter. What's the difference, first of all, between an agent and a promoter?
A promoter doesn't sleep as well at night as an agent does. That's the first thing. A promoter takes all the risks. We go out and rent the auditoriums and do the whole kit and caboodle. Where an agent probably would have a contact with a person and send them a contract, and that would be the end of the communication. For the most part, you probably deal with 30 people other than them above that. I tried being an agent for a while, and I still have my agency booking license.
Right.
but it wasn't for me because I was feeling that if I booked a show and something went wrong, it was my fault anyway. So
Yeah.
I thought, well, if it's going to be my fault, I might as well do it all. Then I
Yeah.
got nobody else to blame but myself. And part of the deal is that it's not rocket science to book something. What's rocket science is be able to put lots of dates with it.
Yeah.
I learned many years ago there's strength in numbers. Going out on the road for one day doesn't do it for me.
Right.
40 days does it for me. Did you go back? It's the same effort. So you go out and you do it. You got full control then. If something goes wrong or somebody's saying something wrong, it's yourself that's doing it. When you're an agent, you're at the beck and call everybody wants to say and do. And I don't like that.
Okay. So how would you define what your role is then?
Well, it's a big role because you're pretty well doing everything. You're negotiating the tour, you're doing the advertising, you're booking the auditoriums, you're booking the travel, you're booking the you're doing everything. You're doing what a staff in a theater would do. If you have marketing people, stagehands, and you have that's where Darren Walters and John Lester fit in the mix. John works here and does the advertising and promotion. Darren does all the technical work, and I put the nuts and bolts together with it, and away we go. The difference is because I'm the promoter and I'm putting the money up, I'm the guy that has to feel it to make sure that what we're doing makes sense.
Yeah.
I got to be careful not to let my personal emotions get in the middle of it.
Sure. What's your relationship with the artist as a promoter?
Well, it's great because 9 times out of 10, I deal directly with the artist, which I really like. So there's nobody throwing curveballs at me that tells me what this artist is like or what they're not like and what they will and won't do. I've got the clear channel right through to them. And that's what's made the business so successful, is dealing one-on-one with them. They don't like all this stuff either. They like to know who the end user is and away they go. So
now, being involved in the Midland Cultural Centre, which is a local venue, I see these productions perhaps from a different perspective. What's your relationship like with venues and house managers and event managers?
well, thank God most of them are very, very good. And thank God after this many years, there's a few of them been around almost as long as I have at it. And you build a relationship up. So it's a one email out, you walk in, everybody's shaking hands and kissing babies and hugs and all that stuff. They're glad to see you come back in the building and everything else.
Yeah.
There is a few that are either too funded by a government source that don't need to care, and therefore they become your competition when they're spending money on stuff they shouldn't, and it gets a little bit trickier there. But generally, I find the relationship I've had with the venues has been very good over the years because we know what we're doing, and I know what they're doing, and they don't give them any hassle. When they don't have to phone me 6 times or worry about the check coming in and all that stuff.
Yeah.
It works good.
Yeah. What's going to happen to the entertainment industry as we come out of COVID?
Well, I said to somebody about 3 months into it, I used to do shows at a little town hall that had 50 people in it. I've got to go back to those days and work my way back up, because the problem is very few people can relate to that type of thing, and I can. So I have to start back. When we get going again safely, we have to think that way. We have to bring in things that are not 75 people on stage and all that sort of stuff, to be very intimate and work it and let nature take its course and see how safe things are. And the biggest thing I want people to do in this industry, and I can't say it enough, don't forget about the public. Without the public, we're in big trouble.
Yeah.
You've got to educate them and make them feel comfortable coming back.
Make them feel safe.
What's that?
Make them feel safe.
Well, exactly, because without them, we don't have anything. And I'm really, really concerned that we're going to have problems there of getting people feeling comfortable enough to go. So, but on the positive note, I'm hopefully going to start going again in November. We're working on a couple of small things now. We'll just creep before we crawl and go from there.
Good, good. I want to do something a little unusual now.
Mm-hmm.
I want to talk to you about some of these talents that you have worked with, and we do have some time to do this. I'm going to, with your permission, I'll mention a name of one of the acts that you have promoted,
Right.
and maybe you can give us a thought or two about that person, because I know our viewers are fascinated by who these personalities really are. So let's start with a mutual friend of ours, Tommy Hunter.
Canada's country gentleman, one of the cleanest, purest first people I've ever worked with on the road, and never, ever, ever, ever have we ever had we did 1,100 shows together. So that should tell you it's wonderful.
Yeah. Rita McNeil.
What you see is what you get. Her heart was as big as her soul, and she was just as genuine and lovable as you can imagine.
Stompin' Tom, we mentioned. Can you tell us a little more about him?
Stompin' Tom was probably one of the fairest people I've ever worked with in understanding, and just a gem for me as a fan, as well as a business relationship, was top notch.
And we've talked a lot about Steve Smith, but let's just flesh that in a bit. You know him very well. He has said that you started off as promoter and artist, and now you're friends. Tell us about the real Steve Smith, Red Green.
Well, I broke every rule in the book. We actually stayed in their house and on their boat and went on 2 holidays with them. And that's very rare for me, because I try not to do that. I try to keep an arm's length. And I treat Steve Smith as if he is part of the family. And he's another one that was just as fair and as honest as could be. Top notch again.
Charlie Pride.
Wow, that's got a lot of emotion wrapped around it, especially these days. He referred to me as a young whippersnapper, and there's another, speaking of breaking rules, I stayed at their place with them too, which is something I don't really do. But Charlie and I were very close friends. He would phone me up and just talk about absolutely nothing, which meant a lot to me, because as a kid, I just thought he was the be all and end all.
Yeah. Randy Travis is a name we haven't mentioned, but you promoted him.
I did. I really liked Randy. I met him. I missed an opportunity many years ago to bring him to Canada, because the radio announcer in the town in Toronto told me he wouldn't draw any people, as he sold out 3 nights at Massey Hall. So, but he was as genuine in this country as you can get. Just a true. I hate to see the poor guy now. He's had several strokes, and it's just pretty, very, very sad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anne Murray is another name we didn't mention, but I know you promoted her.
Met Anne Murray at the CNE when I was 14. I snuck backstage, even at that young age. And the next year she came to Peterborough, and I got a picture of her and I when I was 15 years old. When I booked that date in Peterborough, I cried for a week, because I just thought she was the best ever. And we did the date, and the next day all these roses end up at the house with a little note, "Thanks for everything, Anne." And I'm thinking, my God, I should be sending the roses, because it was a big deal for me. I loved it.
Yeah. One of my favorite performers is K.D. Lang. And again, we haven't mentioned her yet, but you've worked with her.
I did, back in the real early days when she was, I took her down to the East Coast, and Irving Oil had these big production shows on. They did for all their clients. And she was wearing the dresses with the small farm animals on it, doing somersaults off the stage. But I'll tell you one thing, she's one of the most talented voices and genuine people I've ever met. Again, what you see is what you get. I mean, she's very, very much the same on and off the stage. A real sweetheart.
Her version of Hallelujah is just breathtaking.
Oh, she got Stompin' Tom out on television for the very first time after many years. She did a television special in Red Deer, and Tom was her guest on there, and it was magic.
Yeah.
Very, very good.
Wayne Newton. I didn't know he left Las Vegas. Did he tour?
Well, in all honesty, I had seen him so many times in Las Vegas. We brought him to the Peterborough Memorial Center, and it's not the same, trust me. But he was probably the most unique act I've ever worked with. He was just the strangest person ever. But when he hit that stage, he might not have been vocally as strong as he was years ago, but boy, could he entertain. And that audience went crazy over him. He really did.
Another name we haven't talked about yet, but an icon in Canadian music, Canadian folk music, Ian Tyson.
I loved Ian Tyson. We did a lot of shows together. We did one about 2 years ago, and he's 80, I think he's 89 now. And wow. He was great. I mean, he gets up on that stage and he just sits there, and he reminds me of Wilf Carter. They're the same height, when I shake Ian's hands, like shaking Wilf's, the hands are monstrous, because they both worked on the farm. So they were gigantic. No, Ian was one of the best. Super guy.
You mentioned Roger Whittaker.
Roger Whittaker. His biggest influence growing up as a kid in South Africa was Wilf Carter. So we got along great.
Okay.
We could talk about all those stories because Wilf was big in South Africa, the yodeling and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Did about 6 tours with Roger, and he was another one. I mean, I keep telling all these people are great, but they are because they meant so much to me. They're good.
I had no idea that you had had any connection with Weird Al Yankovic.
God, weird. That was a show in the Peterborough Memorial Center. Don Jones, who managed Mr. Dress Up for many years, and Stuart McLean, he ran a theater in London, Ontario called Centennial Hall, but he was also a big promoter. And so he called me up and said, "I'm going to do a Weird Al Yankovic date. What do you think of coming to Peterborough with him?" And I said, "Oh my God!" I said, I can't even imagine. So we did the date, and it was fun. I mean, Weird Al's not weird. I mean, he's a great guy, super.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was good. It was certainly a branch out for him. I'd never done that before.
Well, here's another branch out. Alice Cooper.
Well, back to Don Jones again. It was his son Brad that had him on tour. So he called me and said, "Edwards, we're going to do Alice Cooper. Do you want to be part of it?" And I said, "I'm going to be in Vegas that weekend, but you can bring him here if you want. I'll promote it and everything else." So he called me and says, "Edwards, I need somebody to pick up the snake." I said, "What snake?" He said, "Alice has a snake." I said, "Well, whose insurance are we using tonight?" He said, "Oh, don't worry. It's a Canadian snake." I said, "What does that mean?" Where they're from. But he's another guy that is not Alice Cooper behind the scenes. I mean, he's a gem. Great guy.
Isn't that interesting?
Hmm.
Yeah. Now, I will remind you of a little story before we talk about the next person. And the story took place at Tommy Hunter's, was it his 65th birthday party at the Imperial Room at the Royal York?
Exactly.
And Barb and I were honored to be invited as guests. And we were sitting there really not knowing anybody in the room because it's a whole bunch of people from Nashville or the East Coast, and they're all performers. And we're feeling quite out of our element. And I don't know whether you remember this, Brian, but you came over to me and said, "Do you mind if I bring a couple to sit with you at your table?" And of course, we were delighted, had no idea who it was. I was facing the direction that the person was going to come from. Barb had her back to the person. And I leaned forward and I said, "Barb, you're not going to believe who the guest is. It's Lord Kenneth Thompson." Now, Brian, how did you know him?
He is the biggest country music fan there ever was. He adored Hank Snow. His wife, Marilyn, loved Randy Travis. So I had a 1982 Dodge Caravan with the lights hanging on the back and to tape them on with duct tape. And I picked them up in Toronto to take him to a Tommy Hunter taping to sit there for 4.5 hours to have 5 minutes with Hank Snow. And we went out for dinner with his son David and had a great time that night. And he would keep in touch and write letters constantly because he loved that country music. Yeah. We would go to shows together at the Maple Leaf Gardens and sit and watch Randy Travis or whoever. And he was great. I mean, he loved country music more than anybody ever imagined. And when that Roy Thompson Hall started up, that was our biggest goal, was to get Hank Snow in there for Ken Thompson. Now, I kept saying, it just doesn't fit. I mean, I didn't think it did anyway, but he was great. I really enjoyed our friendship.
Yeah, good. Now, you've written a book that I want to tell our audience about. And first of all, tell me why you wrote the book. How did that come about?
Well, I used to go sit and tell stories with Stompin' Tom at the house. And when he got very sick, I was up there for 2 or 3 days in a row. And he'd said, "Edwards, you got to do me a favor. I want you to write this stuff down." Well, I started to take some notes and go back through it all. It took them for about 4 or 5 or 6 years. And the guy that wrote Tom's book came to me and said, "I heard about this thing." And he came to the house and sat for 3 days and recorded like 900 some pages worth of transcript. So one thing led to another. And when COVID hit, I'd had the draft copy. A guy named Ed Arnold in Peterborough actually picked the book up, who was the editor of the paper here. And he went through it. I'd gone to Australia and he called me. So when you get home, you'll have the book. And of course, COVID was hitting at the time and everything else. And I put it away for 4 months. I said, "I can't look at all this. I was reading my obituary, for God's sake." I put it away. When I got it out and got working with him on it, it was a lot of fun to do, but I would never do it again. But I enjoyed going back and reminiscing about all those great
Well,
years.
this is the book for our audience to have a look at it. It's Brian Edwards, the promoter, and lots of stars on the cover, even more stars between the pages. I mean, it is a who's who of show business for the last 50 years, Brian. It's amazing.
Well, I'm lucky that I had the pictures that I had because I wanted the pictures to tell the story. And I kept explaining that to Ed. I said, we got to have that, because without the pictures, I'm sunk, because I was always in the background. So the fact that I tell the story, but it's really all about the artists and how they influenced and became part of my life. And it was a big part of my life, big time.
And what's the reaction been to the book?
Oh, it's been great. It's both sides of the board has been very good, and a lot of nice, warm compliments and nice write-ups on the book. And Steve Smith wrote a lovely comment saying it's like I'm sitting down having a conversation with you. And I thought, well, it couldn't get any better comment than that. So yeah. I felt if that's what we've accomplished, that's good.
How can our viewers get it?
Well, I made it nice and simple. BrianThePromoter.com. It's great. As a matter of fact, one of the stores up your way, Mariposa Market has it, as a matter of fact. There's a lady there that used to work at Casino Rama that runs that, and she insisted on having it there. So it was good. Very good.
Or they can go online, BrianThePromoter.com.
BrianThePromoter.com, and that's nice and easy. So it works out good.
Well, it's an interesting read. They'll enjoy it. Now let's just talk about the other side of your life. Tell us about your bride, your wife.
My wife Barbara and I met on a bus trip to Nashville, believe it or not. She'll kill me if I don't get this right. 33 years ago, and I said to her, she came to an information night 2 nights before we left on the trip, and I said, "Don't worry, I'll look after you." And we've been looking after each other ever since. We got together about 2 weeks after the trip. We got married 2 years later, and she's as much ensconced with this as I am. She's been there since day one and loves it.
That's great. Final question for you before we wrap things up and take a minute to reflect on this. What's the highlight of your career so far?
Emotionally, taking Rita McNeil to Las Vegas to meet Celine Dion that she hadn't seen for many years.
Oh, isn't that wonderful?
I really got touched by that. When you see Rita break down and get as emotional as she did, and Celine doing the same thing at the same time. And Rita trying to say to Celine, "We've taken up a lot of your time," and Celine saying, "Sit down, I've got all night, I want to talk to you." It was just absolutely special.
That's beautiful.
The 4 of us are gathering in a room with just her, and she was just so that was, if anything, God bless her, that was a real highlight for me. It really touched my heart. It was good.
Well, Brian, I'm just going to take a minute to thank some of the people who made our little conversation possible, and then I'll come right back to you. But I do want to thank our viewers. We really appreciate the support of our audience, and our audience is now wider. Our program is now going into all of sort of central Ontario, Barrie, Orillia, Collingwood, Alliston, Midland, and so forth. So welcome to all of you who are joining the program, and thanks for being with us. We want to thank our friends at Rogers, who provide the technical support for the program, who broadcast on their community channels, and who make it available on demand on their website. Thanks to the MCC staff, particularly to Michelle, who does the promotion for this program in the area of the Midland Cultural Centre, and we're grateful for that. We could not be here were it not for our sponsors. So we have a wonderful season sponsor, the Kathy Bales and Michelle Bichon and Jeff Holloway of RBC Dominion Securities, and they have been with us for years, and we're so grateful for their support. This particular program has been sponsored by the Tom Smith Chevrolet Buick GMC dealership, and we're really grateful to Steve and the guys at the dealership for their support. Brian, I want to extend my special thanks to you. This has been fun, it's been insightful, and it's been inspirational. So thanks so much for joining me.